resume.
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay. Okay, so we're recording this session so that others can hear what we're having to say. And if you've got any problems with anything that you do say during the discussion and you want it to be taken out, just let us know afterwards and we can kind of try and edit the recording down somewhat. So this is a funny kind of a session that I proposed to put onto the program. And to some extent, I guess I was interested in reconvening with a group of people who were involved in a research proposal, a seed proposal, and then a big proposal a number of years ago. So I kind of envisaged this as a roundtable discussion of some of the people that were involved in that project and that proposal. And then it seemed difficult to try and make it just an exclusive thing. So it's been advertised as a more widely. So we're really happy to have other people listen into this discussion and potentially participated at some point during the time we have together. Welcome everybody. I'm wondering whether we want to just quickly go around and say who we are, so we all know who's at our round table. And initially start off with those who were actually involved in this research project. So quickly, maybe I'll hand over to Wendy to introduce herself, and then she can hand over to the next person.
Okay, thanks, Kath, and thanks for the initiative. I'm Wendy Harcourt. I'm here in The Hague. I'm at the International Institute of Social Studies, which is a part of the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. I'm very interested in this because I wanted to talk a bit about how some of the ideas that we discussed I actually took forward into a project. So I wanted to share that with you in this roundtable. So I pass on to Kerry or to Kelly. Those are the people I see.
Maybe pass on to another person from the project first of all. And then,
I see. Oh, Isaac then. I pass it on to you.
Okay. Am I muted? No.
No.
Hi. So my name's Isaac, and I'm here from Western Sydney, in an area called Marylands, which is traditionally owned by the Darug people. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging.
I'll be back in 5 or 10 minutes. I'm going to get a bottle of white wine.
Yeah, I was involved in helping to coordinate the workshop that we had in Cambodia back in 2014. I'm really here to kind of sit back and see how I may contribute to the Community Economies Institute's fundraising aspects. There's some work I've been doing for the Community Economies Institute on that. So I'm trying to kind of tie this together because I still have some more work to put in. This seems like a good way to focus my attention, and reading back through the document, it was nice to be reminded that one of the prototypes was actually Cambodia. I completely forgot it was the Jerris project with the cook stoves. I completely forgot that was.
Isaac, do you mind just let's leave the discussion until just quickly. Yeah, introduce yourself, because I think people won't know what we're talking about until we lay everything out.
Well, I'll pass it over to Jerin, who was also one of the team.
Hello, everyone. This is Ceren Özselçuk from Istanbul. I teach sociology at Boğaziçi University here, and I was part of this project. It's amazing that it was 2015, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the date was both very close, but also far away. And I'm here to revisit some of these ideas that went into the proposal research, because I also used, very much actually insights from this proposal in other, essays and research applications. And I want to think more on that. Yeah. And okay, let me pass it to Kate Rich.
Hi,
I wasn't involved in the project. I'm here as an interested listener, and it's the end of a long working day, so I have my camera off. And I'll pass to. Have you gone through all the people who were?
Yes.
In the,
yes.
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 Kelly.
Hi everyone, I'm Kelly. I'm here in New Zealand. It's 8 p.m. doing the dishes with my daughter. And I'm not involved in the project, but I'm interested to hear more about it. I'll pass to, who can I see? Tim.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Tim Crabtree. I'm in England. It's just gone 7 o'clock in the morning, so I might turn off my screen soon to get my breakfast. So I'm a sort of practitioner within the community economy. Most of my work is around affordable housing, and I guess I was attracted by the word prototyping because we do a lot of work around innovation and prototyping, so I was interested to hear more. And I will pass to Ying.
Hello everyone. Yes, that's the Ying that you know, even though you can't see me. So this is Ying from China, and yeah, not part of the project, but very into community economy, and I'm now living in eco-village in southern part of China. And I was a King's student when I studied at Schumann College. Thank you. And I will pass it to sorry. Let me see. Bronwyn.
Yes,
Yeah.
Ying, your sound was very sort of distorted, so I'm not sure if everyone heard, but Ying's work is in China, working with an eco-village there, and joined their network recently. So I think it's wonderful to have you here with us, Ying. So
welcome, Lee. Hi, is my sound all right, everybody?
Yeah, it's fine.
Thank you. So I am was not part of this project, but I'm a member of the Community Economies Research Network, but joined, I think, right around when this project got funded, because it was right around that time I started to come to the meetings. I remember vaguely hearing about it, and I had moved from Europe, and I just found myself really struck looking at this session today, thinking, wow, when I moved out to Australia from Europe, I thought the program looked exciting, but also just sort of, it seemed the kind of thing that research councils would fund. But after 8 years in Australia, I look at it and I think, wow, what a fantastic thing for I just feel like, I feel like it would be really difficult to get something like that funded. So I'd love to hear how it went and how it came about. And I took it for granted, I think, at the time. There's lots of fabulous work here, but not sort of at that cross-sectoral level. So looking forward to hearing. I may have to turn my video on and off. I've got a little bit of juggling going on.
Okay. Oh, well, thanks. I know everybody's kind of battling different issues, technological exhaustions, early mornings, etc. So it's really nice to have us here together. And I guess I thought I'd just give a little background to what the projects were, and slightly like what we had proposed to do. And then I'll turn to Wendy and Jaron and Isaac to just give some reflections on, their perspective from this point in time now back on that proposal. But I guess I'm interested in, and then the feedback from the rest of you. And I'm kind of interested to see what we could ever reclaim from this project, if possible, going forward. And also, it's interesting, Tim, that you picked up on the prototyping idea, because we were very much out of our depth to some extent in even using that term. So now I know a lot more about transition design and stuff like that, and I'm amazed that we even thought of trying to use the term. But let me just set up the scene a little bit, and let's see. I'm going to try and advance my slide, which doesn't seem to want to do it. Why is that? Right, there. Can you see now that? Yeah. So there were two proposals, and one we got funded for a seed grant, and then we didn't get the big one. But this all was part of an initiative that calls the Transformations to Sustainability Program, which was launched by the International Social Science Council in 2014, and the round came up in 2015. And the whole idea of this was, as it says here, to empower social scientists to take the lead in North-South interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research, addressing the challenges of global environmental change and sustainability. So it just seemed like an amazing opportunity for us to think together around this idea of what does community economies work have to say about transformations to sustainability. And what they did was proposed that we would, I'll just go to the first phase, was that they asked for a seed grant in 2014-15, and they awarded 38 seed grants. And the whole idea of the seed grant was that you would bring a team together and explore the issue and then propose a major research proposal that would go for a number of years for quite a lot of money, and it would be to establish a transformative knowledge network. And we put in a successful seed grant, which was called Rebuilding Livelihoods to Meet the Challenges of Climate Change in Post-Crisis Communities. And then we went on to try and write the bigger grant. And so the team that came together to do this is listed here. And as you'll see, Wendy's with us now, Isaac and Jaren, and many of the other people are going to be joining the second session where we discuss this on Friday, those who are in other parts of Australia and New Zealand and the US. So it was a really interesting attempt in 2015 for us to come together at this point before the formation of the Community Economies Institute. At that stage, interestingly, the CERN network was 100 people, and now it's 300 people. So to what extent we were ahead of our time, I don't know, but that's sort of something that I'd like to explore at the moment. So we put in then, after having this meeting together, which Isaac organised in Cambodia, where we came together with stories from proposals and community economy experimentation that we're all involved in, to try and distill the essence of what a larger proposal, international transformative knowledge network, might be. And we submitted that proposal. It was a huge effort that had to go on a very clunky interface that was coming out of South Africa, because one of the initiatives of this Social Science Council was that you had to be working with a lot of low-income countries as part of the proposal. And working with South Africa was part of their kind of thing, I think, to support the research infrastructure there. Anyway, we put in a proposal called the International Network for Ethical Economic Prototyping. And that was phase one of this big kind of initiative within the International Social Science Council. I think a year or so after that first phase, the ISSC amalgamated with the Science Council to become the International Science Council. And so they are now, it's not the ISSC anymore, it's the ISC, which is listed here in the second phase. And they were again supported by Swedish funds, and then this Belmont Forum and Norface. And this next phase has jointly funded 12 international research projects, which are running now from 2018 to 2022. And that's the website that where those projects are listed. So the three that got up in that first round for that big one were ones that were based in pretty well-established research institutes in Sussex, I think, I don't know whether it was one in The Hague or not, but another based around Ashish Ghosh, I think in India, or in a network that was very well established already. And I think our proposal, I guess, wasn't as coming out of a what was recognised as an established kind of research institute in the same way. So we were terribly disappointed we didn't get the next thing. But on the other hand, we did a lot of interesting thinking, I think, in formulating that research proposal. This next phase 2 is now going ahead, and I just put some of there's 12 projects going ahead. One, this governance of socio-technical transformation, is one that Andy Sterling and Sheila Jasanoff and other people are spearheading out of Sussex and elsewhere. This is another one, urban fringe areas, and one on intellectual property and sustainability transitions. And I've spent a bit of time today looking at some of these proposals, or looking at some of the work that these people are doing. And I got myself down into a big rabbit hole, which meant I didn't get very well prepared for this discussion, because it is very interesting to kind of look at what has been funded and what's come out of it. When I look back at the 3 that were funded in the round we went for, one of them has a defunct website we can't find out about. Another was about sort of transformative learning. And another was the kind of project around Ashish Kathari's work. And so, which I think has gone into the Global Tapestry for Global Alternatives network that he's now formed along with others. So I guess, yeah, the background to what we wanted to do was that the objectives of the project were to try and look or reveal the existing ethical economic practices of livelihood rebuilding initiatives in a range of crisis situations. And our, I'll just jump to the countries that we were working in. So we had members of the CERN network who already were working with communities in Cambodia, for instance, Isaac's work, in Uganda with Mariana Pavlovskaya, in the Philippines with Anne Hill and myself, in India with Kevin and one of his PhD students. In Turkey was Ceren and Shemsa and Yaya working in the Kurdish communities. In Italy was Wendy working in Tushia with her networks. Norway was also Kevin working up in Tromsø, and the USA were a number of people, including Stephen's work in Worcester and the deindustrializing East Coast, and Boone Shear working there too, and also and Mitch Rose working in Detroit. So we had kind of already, examples of livelihood initiatives and that we thought were emulating or were practicing various forms of ethical economic relationships. Then we felt that there was a need to kind of step back from what these different projects were doing and try to extrapolate what was the essence of the kind of ethical economic relationship that was being forged or and was therefore transforming the economy in particular, but also ecologies. And what we proposed was to produce sort of audit tools that would capture and communicate in an accessible way all the kind of decisions that were entangled in those ethical practices. So we were very interested in looking at the kind of points of negotiation that we could identify using some of the tools that we had developed in Take Back the Economy to identify what, how we could step beyond up from the stories to the kind of economic principles that were being enacted, that were becoming a new economic common sense to some extent. So this was the way in which we were trying to conceptualize social transformation, drawing on our kind of theory that there needed to be new languages, there needed to be new subjectivities, and there needed to be a different kind of collective action. So the plan was then to try and generate these ethical economic prototypes that could crystallize the experiences of multiple livelihood building initiatives so that they could be transposed to other contexts. And that was our plan, to try and do that and then test out the transformative potential of these prototypes in kind of labs and real life situations, and build a sort of an acceleration hub where these ideas could be documented and listed into a website that would be an interactive website where people wouldn't just download stuff, but they would also upload their stories of using these prototypes and expanding and developing that kind of knowledge network. So it was a pretty, ambitious project and proposal. And as I said, part of the deal was we had to be involved in a certain number of low-income countries as defined by the UN. And so we were interested in this kind of drawing on the so-called technologies that highlight ethical economic practices that we'd already started to develop in the work we'd done, and then working with these flashpoints around which economic practices form, using audit tools that we developed through the kind of inventories of diverse economies, and then trying to figure out what would be prototypes that could be documented and developed. So I guess the idea of the roundtable was to kind of look back at that proposal for those of us who were involved in it, how robust it was or wasn't, how our thinking has moved on, and whether there's anything that could be salvaged from this, other issues it raises. And I guess I'm really interested to hear, particularly from Wendy and Jaron, and to some extent Isaac. I think all of you have probably taken on ideas from this proposal in different ways in your own work. And I think just before I stop, I just wanted to kind of say that, you know, in the ensuing 6 years, I guess, as I said, the CERN network has grown threefold. It's now 300 people. We've started, and this is a very initial beginning and not at all comprehensive, we've started to map out all the different kind of community building exercises and research and development kind of contexts that the community economies researchers are working with. Some of them very directly and influencing their practice very directly, and others more indirectly. And it seems like we're in a very different place now to even be able to think about the kind of, whether it's called impact, but the kind of way in which our different ideas are kind of feeding into organizations. And still the need is to step back and say, well, what do we distill from this? What do we distill beyond the stories of each of these projects or experiments? So the other thing that's happened, I guess, in the ensuing years is we were able to put together the Handbook of Diverse Economies. In the original proposal, we talked about having a handbook of ethical economic prototypes, which we didn't get to do. But I think in a way, this handbook is a first step towards doing something more like a community economies handbook, which a handbook of ethical economic prototypes would be. And it's great that Kelly's here because she and I were the editors of this volume, which I'm very proud of, and now has gone into paperback. So it's going to be much more accessible, hopefully, to a wider group. And I think the other thing that we've done amongst the Institute members, but others, is we've really become much clearer about the different kinds of technologies that we have developed, whether it's language or representational ones like ABCD, as asset-based community development, which we've used in our own particular way in action research. And, you know, it still is very much, I think Catherine McKinnon and I are finding, and Isaac is finding too, in the development world, an asset-based approach is still a very minority voice in a world in which development is still focused on, you know, making markets work for the poor. So that technology of ABCD, I think we are still using as an approach and a stance in so many different ways. And it is a technology that highlights a kind of an ethical stance towards what's possible, as opposed to all the negativity that comes through other kinds of approaches. There's also the iceberg image and the diverse economy framing, which I think has taken off in all sorts of ways, particularly through the work of artists using it in all sorts of different contexts. And Wendy and Kate and I were involved in the Redrawing Economy project that's happened in the ensuing years with funding from Antipode Foundation, where we've worked with a whole range of groups across the world where Take Back the Economy had been translated, and drew on the kind of ways in which that iceberg image was informing and motivating different kinds of economic experimentation. when, I don't know if any of you heard Kevin's keynote last week, but he talked about the way in which his mapping work has moved into a new kind of phase with the idea of an algorithm that allows him to kind of start to insert the notion of community into marine policy in a way that I think is a very interesting technology that's come out of his work. Again, after like 20 years of working in the same community in those fishing villages and communities of the northeastern US. The IDT is a new sort of technology that's has developed in the last few years as well, which is a kind of an identifier for community economy practices and enterprises. The community economy return on investment is something that we developed in Take Back the Economy, which is now being used in different contexts, and it is itself, I think, a kind of technology that highlights ethical practices and tries to quantify them in different ways or represent them in different ways. The Commons Identikit is also something that's a technology we've developed in the recent, and the surviving well balance, the sort of work balance between the workday and the ecological footprint. And there's a whole lot of other things I think have come out of work that we probably weren't as, I don't know, as aware of when we were writing this proposal. But now if we were to revisit this kind of work, I think we have a lot more to say or a lot more to offer. And I think we were really trying to work with the concerns of to take back the economy, the surviving well, distributing surplus, encountering others, commoning and investing in futures. And we tried to insert that into the proposal using the inventories. And I think the prototype idea was the idea that was the hardest for us to kind of grasp. But we did come up with an example in the proposal, which was this idea of collaborative commons management being put together with direct marketing enabling, which was coming out of the example of community supported fishing out of Kevin's work. But I think we have come up with a lot more of examples of community enterprise, for instance, and the kind of protocols of those enterprises, different experiments. And we have a whole range of examples that of organizations that have drawn on our work in very interesting ways on managing global commons in place. And there'd be a lot more that we could think about there. So that's all I need to say at this point, because I'm interested. I hope I've given you a bit of a introduction enough to what we were working on in order for those who weren't involved to get a sense of it. And now I'd love to hear from, maybe we'll go Wendy first and then Jaron and then Isaac, and just hear some reflections. And I think I'll stop sharing now, if that's okay, unless people want anything from that PowerPoint.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Kath. It's fascinating to see how things have evolved, and you get all sorts of ideas of where it could go. So I guess that's part of what we want to do together. Already done. I wanted to maybe share, just really describe how some of the ideas have informed this EU Horizon 2020 project that I've been doing since 2018. Now it's going to finish in 2022, which was looking at well-being, ecology, gender, and community. And that's a innovative training network where we have 15 PhDs. But I really wrote the proposal having gone to Cambodia with all of you, but also having seen from my point of view, because I was very interested in gender and feminist political ecology, and the idea of how people talk about resilience and sustainability, and fitting that into a sort of EU policy agenda. That was the ways in which we were trying to frame it. So we didn't take the idea of prototypes or necessarily all the tools, but what we did look at was, what we have got is what they call work packages, where we really looked at the idea of how people are living well together and using the community economies, ideas of commons, as one sort of entry point, particularly to look at food and food security and the issue of resilience and sustainability around food, and the ways in which different mostly women's groups, although we talked about gender relations, how they were changing their economic practices in not only, well, mostly urban environments, actually. So unlike, I mean, what we were drawing on was a loose feminist political ecology, but we brought in, particularly with Chizu Sato, who's one of the people who was leading this work package, who's a, and I'm the overall coordinator, but she was looking at the work package. We really were setting up 4 different projects, basically working with different groups in Chennai, in rural Japan, actually in Scotland, in fisheries, and in it turned out to be in Berlin, food gardens. And then an extra one, or the one that I want to mention, is Italy, because that's what we had taken from this discussion in Cambodia. Now, what my reflections on that is that I also like very much the idea of people coming together in a, what you called social lab. We had to call it training lab, so that you could then compare across these different examples and then think what is something we can then build on, which we saw as part of, not a prototype, but the way in which feminist political ecology could speak to these concerns. So it was more a dialogue with ecologists and the idea of community economies from this gender perspective. So we, and Kath being part of it, the training lab we had to have online. So that, to me, the ways in which it was set out, that you would be moving from learning with people in the different communities and then coming and discussing it and then going back. That was something I really picked up from the project, and to try to define what was held commonly in the lab, and then going back and seeing if that worked. We very much used participatory action research approach, and we also used art. That was another thing I really took from the ways in which people work, but that's actually taken off in a very different way. So that's what we wanted to do. And then actually what happened was that the art element became something that really moved itself into completely different kinds of discussions. And we're now art became the thing that people could express emotions, feelings, how they were understanding crisis. So we've done a lot of online art exhibitions, and actually right now at Co-op 26, that's what the group of people who've been working on extractivism are in the co-op doing an art exhibition about communities, how they perceive crisis, and the ways in which art expresses their resilience, if you like. I wanted to flag that as something that I think not art as a tool, but art as an expression and as a way to really understand how people are experiencing crisis seems to have taken, at least in our project, seems to have taken a life of its own. The other thing I wanted to mention was that the whole issue of ethics, which is obviously very clear in the CERN context, we had huge struggles within the group about ethical behavior, how to do research. And I would really like to explore that much more in the future. Part of it was the contradiction between what the EU calls ethics and what we were understanding as ethics in a project. And at one point, the project was frozen because our ethics sort of midway review was rejected. So that's just, I don't know how to say it more clearly than that. This was something, to me, means that ethics is a huge political issue, and it depends on, of course, who's defining it, how it's being looked at. But it would be fantastic to really develop that much more clearly, I think, for others who could take that and then be much more robust in their defense of what it is that they're doing in the face of all these huge technocratic ethical concepts. I'm sure Isaac has lots to say about that, but I mean, for me, that's a big lesson I've learned, and I'm listening to you. I probably should have gone back a bit more to what we've been talking about in Cambodia. Then another lesson I got, which I'm sure everybody's very aware of, but of course, this all happened with COVID. It's happening with the whole range of climate disasters, and that politics totally also fragmented the ways in which we could do research. So it also put into question all the time, why are we doing this research, for what reason? And a lot of things we planned we didn't do because of the, people didn't want to take aeroplanes, people couldn't move. So we were an international network. So that was something I also wanted to flag, is this, when we were talking in 2015, all the constraints of the concepts of flying, or the idea of the kind of crises different people are facing, COVID being one, but there are many others. You couldn't have foreseen that, and neither could we in WeGo, but it's actually really shifted then completely our own way of working together. And of course, we're now all on Zoom, but that's not what I mean. It's a much more profound way. People really deeply question, why are we doing this research? And the societal, political relevance is very important. And the group in WeGo really split because of that, because some people just said, well, we don't think this research is going to support what it is we're concerned about in terms of the kinds of resistances or the politics we're involved in. So I just wanted to also flag that, is that when you've created a project with all its sort of technocratic, bureaucratic needs, and then issues are happening, people can also say, well, that's just a mirage of something, and we want to move to what we see as the real world. It's just a dilemma I'm sharing again with you. Should I stop, Kath? Is that?
Yeah. But also, I guess the issue is that yours was a training program for 15 PhDs with people, supervisors as well. So there was a slight difference in the nature of the proposal. Anyway, we don't need to get into the detail.
No, I know, but it's not so much the yes, of course, but we were setting up a network that was also with different communities. So whether it's a major question of, if you go in to do research in communities, they have their own, the politics that's happening there, the situation that's going on there. It's not about PhDs or not. It's about the issue of research which is viable in a particular political crisis, and how research is perceived. Maybe I'm not explaining it well. It's not, I was just giving a sense of what happened. And then my last point was that how we overcame some of those dilemmas was that we also moved away from just seeing as PhD projects to contributing to the degrowth movement, which was something in the situation where I'm based in The Hague in Europe, and that was one of the debates that and movements that we felt we could contribute to. So we instead of doing our own conference, we did we contributed to and worked for 2 years in putting together a big community event, which was called Caring Communities for Radical Change. So that's what I wanted to say, is that we moved from seeing our goal as 15 PhDs to being part of different political events. I just wanted to flag it as that something that can be surprising in the ways in which projects are evolving when you are doing participatory research, when you are trying to have impact and when you're trying to be transformative. It doesn't mean that your research is going to end up what you start off with. It's going to shift. That was my main point. I'm sharing this as descriptive, mainly just to give you, maybe there are some things there, but my main point there was about the whole question of ethics. And it would be really important, I think. I mean, I think CERN is in a really important positioning to help people think through the ethical economic practice as you go into different transformative research projects. That's okay. Sorry if I took.
No, that's fine. That's great. Thank you. Jaren, you want to step in?
Sure. Yes. You can hear me fine, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right. So Kawar Basin, in which a significant proportion of the Kurdish population was displaced in 1990s through state violence and oppression, was one of the examples or the initiatives that was part of this research. And it was going to be researched by myself, Yaya, and Shemsa. The other two guys are not here right now, so I'm gonna kind of take over and try to say something about that. I mean, it's interesting because the situation, I'm going to go into how I really benefited from this research in a different direction, but that component got disrupted in 2015, especially late 2015, because of the fundamental phase of first kind of counter-revolutionary state violence. Mostly against the Kurdish political organization, but also the opposition that was supporting actually a more multiple opposition, let's say, that was supporting the Kurdish opposition. So there was a counter-revolutionary move by the state. And after that, there was a very significant regime transformation from republicanism to presidential regime. So that, atmosphere really shifted the way that we could do research, and that got disrupted and actually ended soon after. And it's interesting, what Wendy is also saying about this, the discussion around ethics is interesting from at least this perspective as well, because, the position of the ethical coordinates of community economy, that they are decision flashpoints, that they're open to negotiation, and there's a decentralization perspective in some sense that's backing it, was very resonant with the Kurdish or other, populations in Turkey, that who want autonomous, rule. That all these coordinates in the political economy that we name as ethical coordinates were subject to renegotiation. But it was precisely that that was political, maybe the cross-section between the ethical and the political, and it was precisely that was criminalized. So there's that dimension too. I don't know how this adds to what Wendy says, but at least from the state, community's perspective, it's really a core, of the problem. And now I benefited very much from the proposal when I drafted a research on ethics of care I think 2 years ago. And in particularly, it focuses on ethics of care of elderly, that is cared by non-family labor, including non-family Turkish citizens, but also non-family migrant labor. Especially I benefited from, I think, those 3 key dimensions of the research that we who wrote the final draft proposed. The subjectivity perspective, the language perspective, and the collective action perspective. I really use those 3 dimensions a lot, and come to realize more and more with this proposal that maybe we were trying to theorize the collective action perspective, and then the subjectivity and the language were also part of it, a very constitutive part of it, but still maybe the the motivating force was how to organize collective action. I don't know, at least that's how I also benefited from that. But there was something I took from Take Back the Economy that supplemented that framework, which is this measurement question. And especially in the context of care, as I work with different kind of familial care, where a non-family member is part of the care relationship, very different value regimes also, emerge in the discourse. Not only the markets, pricing of care, but different kinds of familial discourses of valuing whether a care is visible or not, whether a care is appreciated or not, how care is appropriated, all those issues. So measurement, I think, became very important in the initiation, at least, of the research that I took, from this proposal. And I'm wondering, in these tools of diversity or the audit tools that we use in terms of capturing the diverse economic practices or diverse ethical practices, whether diverse value regimes could also enter as, as something like maybe even a column, I don't know. It is very implicit in all of these, discussions about diverse economy maps that we have, but at the same time, it's also emerging as something that we need to maybe think about as a, I don't know, as an additional dimension. And I benefited especially from the Commons identity kit, I must say, because of the way that allowed the conversation about the tension of how to bring different valuations into maybe commensurable measurements, but at the same time the multiplicity of that valuing as well. So I mean, it really captures that tension, I think, greatly, at least in the conversations that I had. That tool emerged as a wonderful tool to kind of where I found myself in this tension between finding a common language of valuing and the multiplicity of valuing languages. What else I can say? There were these questions. I mean, there's this question, is there anything here that could be salvaged? I think this idea of deliberating how to create and design a knowledge network is so valuable. I don't know. I mean, and I think it when I again read the proposal, which was, I think, finalized by Kath and perhaps Jenny. I mean, beautifully finalized. I realized how advanced, in some senses, really those ideas were at the time. I'm not sure about the prototype myself as well, but the 4 A's, like how we kind of detailed those the ways that all this collaborative research would come under our audit, or the expansive audit as people more and more join. I mean, I think that's fantastic. Those 4 actions. How might a collaborative project be modified, constituted now? I don't know. I mean, certainly this was written for a certain framing by Social Science Institute, so probably it would be written for another framing. I'm not sure whether post-crisis is still a relevant term. Probably not, because it's either permanent crisis or multi-layered crisis, or is crisis a good term? All these things maybe need to be considered. But I think also there are very different methodologies now that CERN has expanded. I see the kind of the pool of maybe assemblage analysis in this, or science studies perspective, the weight of that in this proposal. But it seems, there's the aesthetic methodologies now very much involving arts, genealogical method that was there in the beginning of CERN CEC research and continued to be used, archival research that's kind of coming up with combining it with the translation questions, indigenous methodologies, so there are a lot of methodologies that are diverse also. So it would be really a challenge to do a collaborative research among CERN members as well. But I think it's also adding an exciting kind of dimension. Maybe performativity is something that, still combines all these different methodologies. But, these are things that this proposal made me think, and it's really fantastic. I don't know. It's revitalized me.
Oh, thanks, Sharon. It's great to hear that. I think there's lots of points both of you have raised, and very interesting to hear about the way in which the very things we were trying to focus on have become criminalized in the context that you wanted to work in. And I guess it makes me think of the session that I think Kerry's actually left now, but we had a session on protest and direct action and what role that plays in community economies work. And I guess to some extent we tried to find cases of places where there was something generative happening and where there were some workarounds around state violence or major crisis or whatever. And that was the idea of the post-crisis. There was a sense in which we were choosing places where there was some reparative action that we could start to theorize. And I guess that's a question, like, is that, we're saying that we're always in a state of crisis now, but what have we got to offer in the case of the Kurdish regions under the regime at the moment? Probably very hard to say, but anyway, that is a kind of one of those issues that's potentially a limitation of what we do because of the type of work we're trying to do. But I'm just wondering, Isaac, would you like to make some comments on your perspective on the proposal now? Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine. I mean, firstly, thank you again for enrolling me into this process. It was very helpful at the time. I was in the middle of my PhD and or I just finished my field work. What it did do for me was help me to think much more closely about the data I had, particularly with an economy of villagers who use bamboo as part of their livelihoods and their basic safety nets. And it helped me to think much more about the relationships and negotiations taking place in the way that they use that to basically produce bamboo skewers for the street food vendors in the town. But what I found is that there's a lot of tacit knowledge and tacit ethical negotiation. There's no written constitution about how they're going to use and share their resources, but they do so in a way that allows communities who've been through crisis without doubt to live side by side with one another, care for the resources, continually maintain and replenish this bamboo. So it did help me in that sense to think more about the about the practices or the negotiations at the center of practices, which then become initiatives of a form. I think reflecting what Jeren was just saying about prototypes, I think that ABCD is a strength of the Community Economies Network, and what that can do is it can amplify existing things that are done well already that may actually be tacit knowledge. In the case that I found, and I've just co-authored a book for a chapter for a design handbook where we are arguing that in this instance, ABCD helped villagers to recognize something that they hadn't really placed a high value on up to then. It was a tacit way of surviving, but it amplified that tacit knowledge and made it more visible and placed more value on that natural resource. So I think ABCD has, some very productive uses, and maybe more generative than prototyping in some ways, or generative in ways that prototyping probably can't be. My readings on sustainability and resilience, I suppose, have advanced more since we did that work. So Zara Baron's work on sustainability, I think, is incredibly generative to actually think more deeply about it, just as a process more than as a set of targets or goals. That was helpful. But then also the work I did with Katherine and others on a paper on economic resilience in monsoon Asia, which was again, I think, helpful for focusing specifically on keywords and practices that are at the center of any initiative. So it was really speaking to what this proposal was about, which was, amplifying negotiations at the center of practices before we can really get to the kind of padded out initiatives, the 10 initiatives that were included. It struck me at the time that the initiatives per se were great, but what we were really concerned with is extrapolating the negotiations and relationships within those initiatives. That's what might transfer rather than the initiative itself. So the Monsoon Asia paper, I think, was very valuable for my thinking as well, in helping me to think about, what are these everyday, mundane, already existing practices that constitute resilience. And then sometime after doing my PhD, I returned to where I did my work with Katherine to focus on this huge bamboo bridge that the communities built in Kampong Cham in eastern Cambodia. It's a 1.5 kilometer long bamboo bridge that has been built for generations. And this would be an initiative writ large, I think, of a community instigated mode of resilience and prototyping, with all the kind of negotiations with natural resources and communities that took place, that we captured on film. It was a really fantastic thing. Unfortunately, the bridge came to, well, it hasn't come to an end. It came to an end in 2017 when the authorities decided they were going to build this huge concrete bridge. And coincidentally, it was a year before a general election where the Prime Minister was stood to lose the forthcoming general election. They were losing popularity, and bridges were a mode of galvanizing voters. So we were there at a time when they were winding this bridge down and replacing it with a concrete one, but it has endured since then. It has actually proved to be resilient, albeit as a tourist attraction and a footbridge, but they do still build it. So I think that there was something ongoing there, that that it may be, tacit again, it may not be explicitly recognized, but I think the authorities have recognized that that bridge, which is built every year in the dry season and taken down during the monsoon rain when the water rises, so it's providing people with work every year, it's providing communities with activities. So I think there was a reason why it endured. And since then, the NGO that I work with, called Buddhism for Social Development Action, who I partnered in my research, have built a huge, a large yoga retreat entirely out of bamboo in the same locality. And that's continuing, I think, the relationship that local communities have with bamboo. It seems really to be at the center of things time and time again in the place that I was working. So it's a situated, place-based, I think, illustration of what can be done. I went back there and worked with them did an action research project to get plastic out of the supply chain for this resort. I stayed there for a couple of months, and we eliminated, I would say, about 75% of the plastic that was coming through that resort, because it was supposed to be an eco-tourism initiative. What I think is also generative about that is that because it's a tourist intervention, then there's a lot of communication with foreigners, with backpackers. That in itself can, I mean, it's controversial to say that because of what Wendy was just saying about flying and everything, but it is at least a way, I think, of disseminating that practice and what goes on in that community. They are undergoing a new building phase with all of the employment going to people from the local villages again. So it really galvanizes the community around the resource as well. So
maybe you wrap up now.
Yeah, okay, so wrapping up, I guess I would say that bottom upwards interventions are I think a much better way to go with if you're applying to do new research grants. The GERES one was interesting because it's a kind of north-south partnership. I suppose that's interesting for prototyping and stuff, but yeah, I think to wrap up, I would say that things have moved on with the discussion of sustainability and resilience now, and there's updating to be done, and I think there's just a whole body of new research that we have to draw on that would perhaps come up with some different interventions than we had before.
Thanks, Isaac. Yeah, I mean, I think for those of us interested, it would be quite insightful to look at some of the proposals that have got up under this second round that are being funded, in order to help us clarify what it is we feel we have to offer beyond what other projects are doing. And I guess to me, it does seem like we were trying to get at that question that I think the session before this afternoon, I had to leave early, that Kelly was running, is asking, how do these so-called grassroots or place-based projects sort of scale to some extent? And I think the way that Kevin's been approaching his work is one way that our work does do that. And I think we can be theorising more the ways in which what we're doing is influencing policy at a national or at a regional scale, it is a lot about the revaluing, just as Marilyn Waring's work revalued women's labour and got that finally, on the agenda in national accounts and so on. There is a greater feeling of the need to value, care work or direct provisioning, food provisioning, or direct care of environments, more ephemeral ways of dealing with infrastructure. Well, I mean, we could argue there's an attempt to start to do that. And there is a way in which I think our work is beyond the grassroots, but we need work. I think we need to do more work to kind of to vocalize that. And that's partly why I wanted to bring this discussion up again, because too much, I think at the time we get positioned as just doing local interventions, which I think that's partly that idea of something that would travel beyond the actual story, and whether the prototype language is the right one or not. Maybe it'd be great to hear from those of you who hung in here to listen to this discussion. So perhaps might open it up to either Tim or Kelly or Kate or Ying to make some comment or ask a question at this point, because I know we've been going on for an hour and a quarter now. So thanks for your attention, by staying with us. Would anyone like to ask a question or make a comment? Oh, Kelly can't say anything. She's putting a toddler to bed. But I think there's intersections between, she had a session earlier on talking about partnerships, particularly with government, and we're talking about the projects that they're doing in New Zealand and also with Maori communities. And Teppo joined from Finland, who's written this book about community economies in the welfare state. And there was an interesting discussion there about kind of what the nature of partnerships could be with, authorities that might often be seen as monolithic, but of course aren't, and are actually open to potentially enabling kind of potentially community economies. Community economies initiatives. And one of the examples that Graydon talked about was this interest in composting that's happening at a sort of city level, where Auckland's got a much more kind of centralised corporate style composting with big composting machinery that will centralise all the food waste and organic waste, whereas other groups are trying to do much more volunteer, community-based kind of composting that brings communities together around connecting to their own soil and their own food waste. And I was kind of interested to see whether we can't think about there being a diverse landscape and something like that, where you would see the benefit of both those types of interactions, you know, because of the need for, you know, hospitals and big institutions to have something that's not necessarily done by community members, but community members who want to opt into that kind of relationship is a way of really building something beyond what's normally happening in cities. So anyway, that's a discussion that could easily come out, but there does seem to be kind of, I sometimes feel like I'm wrestling with an octopus with our work. There's so much potential and there's so much variety, I suppose, and we're doing a lot of work in so many different directions. I think, Sharon, you kind of nailed it with all the different kind of forms of work we do and the methods we use. And we're not doing just one thing, and that makes it harder when we come to thinking about a proposal, because when you look at a lot of these big proposals, they've kind of got one idea or one strategy, and we're always looking at those kind of intersections, and it makes me wonder whether, you know, we would ever have the capacity to do one of those big kind of projects. I don't know. Yeah, but I do feel like our work is validating things like direct marketing, direct exchange, direct food provisioning, you know, environmental care, long-term perspectives, direct transactions. But, you know, of the work that Jenny and Steve and I and Joe did with manufacturing, I'm interested to hear from Rob next when we talk on Friday. He said our report on manufacturing, which was trying to reframe manufacturing as a site of inclusivity and a site of environmental care potentially. He said he's been really influential in his new job working in the corporate sector now. So it's just, how do you kind of track the tentacles of influence and how these ideas are informing things is the challenge, I think. So, Tim, have you finished breakfast? Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, something that came to mind was that I've been doing some work with Johnny Gordon Farley, who's just become a member of the CERN network, and we actually live in the same town, so it's easy to kind of work together. And
he's got an organisation called Stir to Action, just for others to,
know. So we're both being funded by something called the Friends Provident Foundation, and they have a program that's around sort of local economic development, local economic resilience. And our work, my work in that is around innovation and prototyping around affordable housing, but he's focused in particular on the kind of policy environment within which sort of community economy initiatives try to do their work. And we had a session a couple of weeks ago where we were looking at the relationship between broadly speaking, people within the sort of diverse economy, community economy world in the UK interact with people in the public sector. And I think it's been very interesting. So on the one hand, there are interesting kind of partnerships developing between community economies initiatives and the public sector. So for example, in my work, For example, in community energy, we've been working closely with local councils to put photovoltaics on schools and hospitals. In the sort of arena of housing, we've been doing a lot of work over the last 10 years with about 14 local authorities across the Southwest. And then again in food, I was involved in an initiative where we developed a community enterprise that ended up producing school meals for primary schools. So what's interesting to me, and I think also to Johnny, is that those relationships can be kind of a bit paradoxical. That on the one hand, we are kind of we're the ones that do the prototyping. We're the ones that are proposing innovations within different, those different domains. But my experience is that you get to a certain point where the potential for innovation or further prototyping gets closed down. You kind of, I don't know whether it's you get sort of put into a box, or that possibly you've just been co-opted, by those public sector organizations who will allow you to sort of take things so far, but no further, or whether it's a failure within those community enterprises themselves of sort of losing their original radical kind of urge, and as I say, possibly just allowing themselves to become co-opted. So I think there's something about the nature of the relationship between people working in what we might call the community economy sector, and the partnerships that we develop with people in the public sector. And what is something about the nature of that relationship and the challenges one ends up facing, certainly in my experience. There seems to be this pattern of, as I say, kind of getting to a certain point and then almost like the radicalism kind of draining away and getting stuck.
What is it that gets closed down, do you think?
So if you take the school meals example, when we started, it was all about education. It was about involving volunteers in, getting parents involved in the school, getting the children to actually direct what initiatives should happen. And the thing kind of evolved, and it's a sort of very long story, but in 1981, the government got rid of nutritional standards, and then in 2006, they decided to reintroduce them 25 years later. And that meant that primary schools had to offer hot meals again. And none of the primary schools had the capacity to do that. All of the kitchens had been ripped out. And so we set up this community enterprise, working with parents, but also with schools, to do it for ourselves. But in that sort of transition, we've sort of developed that community enterprise. It now serves 56 schools. It's very large, but there's no volunteers involved. The children don't really have much of a say in how it operates. It's become kind of professionalized. And in that professionalization, I think a lot of what was distinctive about it maybe 10 or 15 years ago has been lost. And I've seen that in other areas like community housing, where you kind of get channeled down a route where you have to end up working with big non-profit housing associations that are not democratic in themselves, and essentially sort of take over the process of development of these community housing initiatives. So again, this sort of urge towards professionalization, I don't know if that's the right word, but it seems to squeeze out a lot of the kind of original radical intention of these initiatives. And I think there's something important in acknowledging that, and how do we deal with, I don't think you can necessarily avoid it or criticize it necessarily, but how do we get beyond that stuckness, I suppose? Because those relationships with, you know, local councils or other, you know, sort of organizations can be fruitful to a certain extent, but they can also close down, you know, the potential for innovation or prototyping. So
I mean, what it raises for me is this idea that we actually have a lot of examples now of things that have a history, like at least 10 or 15 years of activity or action that could be analysed from a range of point of view to try and look at that kind of issue, you know. And there's cases that of things that have been quite successful, or, you know, one of the sessions at this Ljubljana is a film that Juan Salazar made that I had something to do with, about a permaculture garden and education centre up in northern New South Wales that's been going for now 20 or 30 years or so. So, you know, very driven by an individual that has and a network behind her. But and then I think Kevin's work is talking about 20 years of work with fishing communities, and it's changed dramatically over the time that he's worked with it, where community supporting fishing was a big thing, and now that's dropped out of the picture, but there's other things going on. Then there's the group in India around Ambedkar University, where they've been using community economies work in 100 different villages, according to Anup, who came to one of the sessions earlier at the Ljubljana. And Bhavya is she's working for like 7 years now with a particular community of single women. But I mean, I think it seems like there's an opportunity there of both kind, like a range of different examples to try and interrogate. I mean, the other example is the Mondragon case, which, you know, we've always written as a great example of kind of deliberation around a new economic pathway. But when I talked to Fred Freundlich, who works at the Mondragon University now, he said he would argue that a lot of that fervour around cooperativism is lost now. Young people don't even understand. They work in the cooperatives, but they don't have that sense of why these things are cooperative. And the cooperative, the education they're getting isn't one that's kind of revitalising that kind of spirit. So it does seem to me there's a chance to, I mean, if we had, you know, some person in the sky gave you some funding to kind of have a think tank that would actually look at some of these real examples in real time and try and analyse what's happened. Is it to do with numbers of people involved or not involved? Is it to do with the founder, you know, the entrepreneur who started something dropping out? And what is it, the assemblage that's around these things, or the ecosystem that does or doesn't build up around these kinds of initiatives? So it does seem like that kind of sort of analytical thinking needs to happen a bit more if we want these kinds of, and, you know, exercises, interventions to actually take root, because yeah.
And I don't think it's, I mean, maybe I've sort of painted a completely negative picture, but I'm also interested in what are those moves that people can take to get out of that stuckness. So, you know, so for example, I'm involved in a community energy project, which has got a bit stuck. You know, we've raised lots of money and we've put PV on roofs, but, you know, it's that classic thing where you've got a commons, but you've got no commoning, because they're just things stuck on a roof generating electricity. But we've now got into, we've sort of stepped us to one side in a sense, and we've just set up our first local energy cooperative. And that, I think, opens up enormous opportunities. It's about matching local production with local use, and there's a lot of interest in it, and you can then link it to lots of activity around, you know, energy efficiency and fuel poverty, etc., etc. So that's one example.
It's as though it's the same as saying food is not just calories, it's actually a whole culture, or energy is not just energy, it's actually a culture. And, you know, the whole argument at the moment with technology is going to solve our climate change problem, that's where it's so wrong, because any of these new things, these renewables or whatever, have to be tied into a different culture of consumption and of support and care, etc., that is being ignored by that kind of technology roadmap keeps getting used by the politicians. But I think you're right. And then how does that stay vital? How does that community connection stay vital? I think is, you know, really a challenge. But I mean, that does seem to be what we could start to think more about. And yeah.
I would just like to add, Catherine.
Yeah, good. Then jump in, Isaac.
Just to what you were saying, that, you know, what you were saying there, the technology-focused solutions, is the very reason why I think that crisis is still important, because it's a crisis of thinking, banking on things like carbon capture, banking on technology solutions that don't even exist, that can't conceivably get us out of the hole that we're in. I mean, I'm talking about Australia specifically and Scott Morrison here, but I think it's a poverty of thinking when it's, you know, all about futuristic thinking and hypothesized technological innovations without any social context, without any thought for how these things are even going to be adopted. Just the assumption that science will take care of it. I think that's a manifestation of crisis in itself.
Yeah. That, I mean, Stephen made
and the justification for a think tank, in other words.
Yeah, yeah. I was just thinking, Kelly can't say anything because she's putting a baby to bed, but Stephen brought up the idea of that notion of future design or something, where you actually think forward to what you want, and then including, you know, these kinds of relationships, for instance, and then try and work back to what we have now and see what it is that we would need to set in place to kind of get those other kinds of relationships and to be, I mean, I guess to be more prevalent, or what kind of networks or infrastructures need to be there to kind of help make these things more real. But yeah, it does seem like there is an intersection here with the kind of transition design thinking that some people are doing. And maybe that came up with the degrowth conference. I wonder, Wendy, did that sort of thing come up there?
I think what came up, yeah, I mean, what came up was that in a way, there's still those, the science technology needs to be unpacked as very political. I mean, when I say politics, I just mean it has its own culture, right? So that it's also very excluding of ideas of relationships or care. But yet, I mean, forever there's been that, at least oddly enough, I'm reminded of C.P. Snow, you know, different cultures of science and humanities, which has been going on forever, probably. But in the Canadian communities, there's a huge that debate, that degrowth conference. There was a huge debate around. It wasn't about technological fixes, and it was about understanding the issues of how to form. Well, exactly what Tim was saying. How to be doing the commoning rather than just forming the commons, and also looking at people's own, it's very tiny in the sense of small, like how do you yourself understand the technologies you have, and these workshops that are here in The Hague, for example, of older people who are you know, fixing things that are breaking, and instead of throwing them away, learning how to fix them. I mean, that's a very small thing, but it really struck me that was also about reclaiming the notion of science. It's a technology, it's something you can learn, and to even at the level of fixing, I think, old lamps or bicycles is a big one here in The Hague, of course, but these sorts of things. So yeah, although overlaying with that was always this issue of, I must say, the degrowth, there's a lot of sense of guilt about privilege and you know, consumption and all of that, which I think blurred a bit these more interesting regenerative or ways of thinking positively. There's always falls back on a kind of sense of, well, at least in that particular conference, lots of interesting things, but this overall sense of, yeah, how to let go of consumption. So that's where these sorts of ideas of science and technology came in.
I mean, the reference Isaac made to the Bamboo Bridge was an interesting, I mean, that is about the kind of skills that people have and are potentially being lost for the next generation, not knowing about how to work with bamboo in that particular way. And that partly was one of the reasons we made that film, was to kind of document those incredible making skills and relations with nature, the kind of idea of how to build a bridge while a river is running through it at the time, you know, like just documenting the actual process that, and not just tacit, but actual knowledge that had been amassed over, you know, many years there. And I think there is an aspect of that, that's, you know, that I guess it's that valuing of those knowledges and the language that goes along with it that's always been part of our work that still needs to happen. And in terms of, yeah, I mean, even in the project that Stephen and I are working on Cooling the Commons, it's working with people in social housing in Sydney, Tim, where they're, you know, people are in the hottest part of the city, and the older generations still know how to do things like open windows and put blinds down and put wet sheets over air to get the air, cool air if they can't afford, or when to turn the air conditioning on, just when, so that they can afford it, for instance. But the younger generation don't know any of that sort of thing anymore. They just sit with the air conditioning or go to sit in McDonald's or something. So, you know, there's a way in which our work is also about that, you know, documenting those knowledges before they go, and also revaluing them in some ways to say that they do have a part. They're not just pre-capitalist or, you know, primitive or all that kind of, and I guess that's the intersection with Indigenous knowledges is really important too. So, yeah, it's, there's an incredible richness, I think, in what we have to work with, and it's how to kind of, I don't know, kind of, you know, we have a lot of, we have got a lot of thinking power here, how to kind of channel it in a way that's best, or could have most, I don't know, impact, or impact's a sort of weird kind of word, but yeah, have more legitimacy, I suppose, is something that I'm interested in, and the Community Economies Institute is interested in, not just for the sake of getting research funds, but I guess for the sake of getting our work out there. I think it is getting out there. We don't really often know where it is. We kind of stumble across it. I mean, when Anup said that there were 100 villages in India that were doing community economies interventions based on take back the economy, my jaw dropped, you know, I thought, what? But, you know, I didn't really know that. But that's the kind of thing we kind of find out. But what to do with that is the kind of question. And yeah.
Katherine, I had a question about Cooling the Commons as well. Do you think that pattern thinking presents an advance on prototyping in some ways, if the objective is to see how far you can extend things and see how things travel?
Well, as much as I understand pattern thinking, I'm still trying to get my head around. I mean, I feel like the design and pattern thinking world is, I mean, even though I've been working with people who are in that world now for a number of years, I'm still trying to grasp exactly how to interact with it. And I think, you know, partly to me, it seems that it's, you know, they are focused on more the material and the technological ways in which these ideas would become embedded in something, so that they seem to be not needing to be consciously thought about, but are then part of the environment. Therefore, the conscious action of subjectivity isn't needed anymore, because the environment is structured in such a way that one works, you know, in terms of our terms, in ethical, economic ways. So how to kind of, you know, what are the patterns and infrastructures that would allow for the common sense of community economy ethical practices to be embedded in such a way that you don't have to think about them to act is the kind of challenge. And I'm trying to still get my head around what that means. And I guess so I think yes, Isaac, but I really am still, I think because so much of the design stuff still comes out of objects and things, and so much of community economies work is still about relationships, I find it hard to put the relationships and the subjectivity issues together with the materiality and embeddedness of that. I mean, I can see how, you know, economic theory has got embedded into national income and product accounts, and to what extent Kevin's work on communities and an algorithm of communities at sea is now going to get embedded in marine policy is, you know, that is setting up a way in which now he could say you can't have a discussion around fisheries policy without thinking about the communities of fishers that are associated with that. You know, whereas in the past you could easily just talk about fish populations and big ships and small ships and stuff like that. So if that's a form of redesign, if that's a new pattern, then I think that's what we're kind of aiming for here, to try and see how these kinds of principles that might move towards a more sustainable living, well-being and so on can become embedded into, you know, our city infrastructure, our intellectual infrastructures and so on. But, you know, I just doing this new project in Papua New Guinea where we're looking at all the research that's been and interventions that have been done over the past 30 years in Western Province, where every project starts with all the problems and not one project starts with what is there that's working in this community. Just makes me realize how a particular mindset has so informed development, because there has to be a solution that's going to come from outside. You know, it's so part of our thinking and our infrastructure of thinking, and it's still there very much so, despite, and I don't think sustainable developments did much to shift that, you know, the Chamber's work, which seemed to be so radical in the 80s. So, you know, that's where I'm just getting probably confused because it's 20 to 8, I haven't had my dinner. But this is the kind of broad-ranging discussions I think we need to have to kind of try and clarify and push ourselves a bit further. And I think design thinking helps because it does take me into an uncomfortable area where I don't quite know what I'm saying or thinking about, but it does kind of help push things along, potentially.
I relate to that. When I was doing the pattern deck for the Cooling the Commons project, I was constantly thinking, where are the people in here and where are the relationships between people? I could see, I mean, the relationships people have with the environment and the way that is kind of co-produced, but and to some extent the public spaces and the amenity and things like that. But it did feel like you're saying the focus was very much material and not so deeply related to the subject positions of people involved in that. It seemed to be more than human, kind of without much human interaction.
But I think, you know, they'd probably challenge us on that, but we need more conversation. I mean, Tim, when you were saying you're interested in prototypes, I'm wondering how your interest in that intersects what we're talking about.
Well, I think this question about the material, I think, is quite interesting because within the design world, you know, people are often prototyping with materials, aren't they? Just sort of coming up with things. And so I'm really interested in the work of Tim Ingold, and because I think that, well, again, that's a kind of long story, but if I bring it back to the work around affordable housing, I think one of the frustrations that we were facing is that most community housing projects take a very long time. So they might, you know, if you're lucky, they might take 3 or 4 years. But in Bridport, for example, we've got a co-housing project that is on site, but people won't move into their houses. It'll be about 12, 13 years from when they started And so one of the things that we've become really interested in is how do you engage people in the kind of community housing development space in a much more practical way. And so we've been running, for example, workshops on building tiny houses. So, and that kind of links to a homelessness charity that needed some tiny houses for some of their clients. We've been looking at getting hold of empty shops that we can turn into maker spaces that we can then use as the base for doing, you know, retrofit or refurbishment work on properties, working with local people. So just asking that question, how do you make these processes of prototyping, innovation, whatever, more immediate and more tangible? And I think, you know, the responses we see from people who are just working with, you know, locally, you know, sourced timber or clay, or, you know, we've got a project working with farmers where we're going to be growing hemp as a material. And, you know, we were playing around the other day, just sort of mixing up clay and hemp. And, you know, the people's responses to that is very interesting. They always want to touch the material, and then the touching of the material generates a conversation that you wouldn't otherwise have had. And so, yeah, we're kind of actually quite interested in how those kind of material processes and material things that we can sort of introduce can then generate these conversations that might then lead people on to doing something practical now rather than in 12 years' time. So
yeah, no, that's fascinating. Jaren, do you want to make a comment or jump in? Oops, we can't hear you. Still can't hear you. Don't know why. It doesn't say you're muted. Something.
Hello?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Well, perhaps it's too late, but I was going to ask Kath, you mentioned something about Kevin's research, the community supported fisheries, which was kind of the example through which we thought about prototyping, how that innovation combined a relationship which then can be translatable to other contexts in terms of scaling up or scaling horizontally, however we want to think about the question of scaling. I'm wondering what happened, like you said, that fell through or that got transformed, that community I mean, the prototype got transformed. And what does it say about prototyping? Because there was also in the proposal, these prototypes are in constant kind of change and openness to renewal and rethinking. So it's not like they're fixed models. You know, there was all this, I think, debate in the proposal differentiating model, fixed model or from a prototype. Yeah, just wondering.
I don't know the total story, but, you know, it was a big thing for Rob and Kevin, you know, 10, 15 years ago, because these communities whose income was being challenged, you know, started to get a fish for a more diverse range of fish. And then people started learning how to eat fish again, and they developed this community supported fishing. So people would start buying the fish, you know, and supporting the fishermen. And that got spread across the US. But then it stopped in Port Clyde, and we need to ask Kevin why. I don't know. But what he talked about in his keynote was the challenges that are coming to these communities from wind farms, from conservation areas for whaling and so on, and climate change, where the water is getting warmer, so the fish are all moving north up towards the Arctic. And so the fish species that each of the communities used to go for, they can only get them if they now go much further from their usual fishing grounds, but only those with big boats can get there, and some of the smaller boats have changed what they're fishing for. So, and what that's meant for their livelihoods and why the community supported fishing thing has changed, I'm not sure. We need to ask. But
Okay.
it's it is, yes, because that was one of the prototypes, that there was a commons management going on and direct marketing coming together. Like the direct marketing was giving a livelihoods for them to start being able to be commoners and not overfish certain species. So that coming together of these two practices.
That was also very powerful, I think, in that idea. That articulation or that relationship is something that's transported.
But I think we could see, say, in Bhavia's work, there's a kind of earth repair and care taking place with direct food provisioning. So those women in the Sangathan that she's working with are now going back to growing millet and seeds and crops that they would have not grown because of Green Revolution, kind of growing for export or growing for trade, as opposed to growing for food. And it's led to then regenerating the land and using the old sort of some of their, things that they remember their parents using in terms of ways of managing pests and so on. And it's been that's because they've been able to collectivize their labor as single women and together get access to some land where they've been able to then start to do that experimentation. So there's a whole coming together of a range of things there into a kind of an assemblage of care and provisioning and food security and challenging singleness. So it was those kinds of relationships we were trying to kind of see as having some kind of, some interaction that was worth noting and naming somehow, But the actual story, I don't know. And that's why, I think it's why we need these conversations to kind of sort of flesh out this kind of stuff. Because the problem with any grant proposal or new proposal comes up for funding, they want you to have thought it all through and put in your proposal as if you've done the research. And in some ways, this is very exploratory work we're doing or thinking about. And we need the opportunity to do that exploration, thinking together, not asking for the money to be able to do it. That's always, it seems like that's the challenge, But I'm looking at the time and it's 8 minutes to 8 in Australia. And I'm wondering, Kate's probably already asleep in a caravan down there in Tasmania. Kelly's probably got everyone to sleep and maybe still asleep. I don't know. She's been putting little things in the chat though. I'm thinking we probably should wrap up. And Wendy, I don't know whether you got anything else. We didn't get back to the ethics question, but I think that's a really important one but maybe we need to frame a discussion about that, as a one-off at some other time. Because I'd love to hear more about that.
I mean, this has been great. I found it really useful. I was saying to Sharon that I'm just starting a 2-year project on issues of care and based on women's communities in South Africa and also Indigenous communities in Argentina. Don't ask me how that happened, but it has. And we're working that through. So I would love to continue those sorts of conversations. And this has been, I'm very interested in how that could link into future work. And also actually the degrowth issue. I think that's something I'm trying to understand how to link more with that conversation, because there's a lot that resonates, but it isn't. It's much more ecological, economic kind of thinking than the sort of I find much more exciting thinking around the community economies. So that's all. I mean, I've just learned a lot. Thank you very much for setting this up. I wish I could be at the next one, but I think it's a really strange time.
It's at where's my piece of paper? I've lost it. It's on Friday.
It's late, I think, for us. Very late.
It's too late for you guys.
That's
it's a time that fits the Americas.
Okay.
to some extent.
I think it's at 12 maybe p.m. for me, and maybe for
yes,
Randy.
but it will be recorded. So I mean,
Yeah.
hopefully, yeah, we can make the recordings accessible. And you know, I'd love to think of what we do from here in terms of having maybe some more targeted discussions around particular things if people are interested. So, you know, anyone that is interested, just get in touch with me, because I think, yeah, I'm not willing to write another research proposal anytime soon, but I'm interested in the discussions and seeing where we go with them. So, well, thanks everybody. Thanks Kate and Kelly and Isaac and Tim. Great to meet you and have a chance to really hear what you've been up to. And wonderful, Wendy and Jaron, to see you again and have you interacting with this old project. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for organizing this. It was great.
Stop recording, I think. Yeah, okay, I'm going to stop recording. I'll see some of you at other sessions maybe. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.